In our recent lessons, we've been talking a lot about the cardiovascular system, and really it's time to move that on now, and we're going to start our development of understanding for the respiratory system. But the first thing to say is that we can't view these systems as separate entities. They're very, very much intertwined. Let me give you an example of that. The whole objective of our breathing structure, so that being our nose, our nasal cavity, our mouth, taking air down the trachea, into the bronchi, into the bronchioles, down into the lungs, into the alveoli, is to get oxygen into the bloodstream. And it does that because the bloodstream is provided in the lungs via the vascular system, a series of capillaries and vessels that run through the lungs, and of course the blood is pumped there via the heart, the cardiac system. So we have to see these as intertwined systems. But at least in the case of today, on this particular lesson, we're going to have a look at the respiratory system in its own kind of right. Look, with EdXL, you're not necessarily going to be tested on the different parts of the structure of the respiratory system. However, I do think it's important you have an awareness that, of course, what we do is we draw air into our nose or into our mouth, and that air then travels down this pipe, which we call our trachea. Look, there it is. And then it branches into the left and the right lung from these major branches called the bronchi or the bronchi, and then gradually down into smaller and smaller bronchioles. Here's the word bronchioles, until we arrive at alveoli. And I've actually brought a picture of alveoli here. So if you can imagine, we're right at this point here. We've got this bronchiole leading down to these kind of air sacs, these millions and millions of little air sacs. And what you can see in terms of these little blue lines that run across the air sac, these are capillaries, okay? So what that means is that once the air has been taken down into that microscopic aspect of the lung, oxygen can then be what we call diffused or passed across the alveoli membrane into the blood, and likewise, carbon dioxide, for example, can be passed from the blood into the lung, into the alveoli. So that's what it is, how it's structured. And the other thing I'd say, just by means of an introduction, is that breathing is mechanical. Okay, breathing is a mechanical process. And what I mean by that is it's powered by muscle. Okay, it's powered by muscle. And all that happens really is that our chest cavity, we sometimes call it our thoracic cavity, look, this kind of cavity around here, this chest cavity just gets bigger and smaller, and as it gets bigger, the area inside the chest cavity gets larger and the pressure goes down, so air rushes in, and that's called breathing in or inspiring. And when the chest cavity lowers and gets smaller, it kind of squeezes the air out, and that's expiring or breathing. And we achieve that by the contraction and relaxation of certain muscles. And one of them is named here, the diaphragm. We also need to have an awareness of the intercostal muscles as well, which sit in between the lungs. I'll talk about those in a future video. I say sit in between the ribs, I should say, and I'll talk about those in a future video. So all that being said and all that being understood, or at least the essence of that being understood, let's move on to some of the key aspects of this particular video. I'm saying this is about respiratory system and exercise. So I want to know what are the short-term effects of exercise. What actually happens to this breathing system when we start to move, when we start to play sport or take part in an aerobics class or whatever it is that we're doing? Well, you'll know some of these because they're obvious and they're common sense. The first one is that we breathe faster, right? We get an increase in breathing rate. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, but when our breathing rate increases, it doesn't necessarily mean we're breathing deeper. It just means that we're breathing faster. So there is a difference between breathing deeply and breathing fast. And that's exactly why we say as well that separate point is an increase in breathing depth. Okay, so see those 2 points as separate because they're actually achieved in different ways, and you'll come to learn about that perhaps if you go into A-level P, for example, an increase in breathing depth. All right, and actually it's this one that happens first. We tend to breathe more deeply as we start to exercise, and then as we get into sort of tougher, harder, more maximal exercise, the breathing rate actually increases as well. And there's some interesting reasons for that, which I'll go into in future videos if you kind of stay studying with me. Once we are exercising as well, we're able to increase the rate of the removal of CO2. Okay, so we can get rid of CO2 more effectively because we're breathing more deeply and breathing faster. Bear in mind as well, because we're exercising, we're actually producing more of this stuff as well. So we can actually get rid of it via the respiratory system and breathe it out of our lungs. And finally, our final short-term effect, or at least the ones I'm going to discuss with you today, we have and this is probably the most crucial point, we have an increased amount of oxygen. We have an increased amount of oxygen in the lungs. And because of that, we're actually able to get more oxygen out of the alveoli into the bloodstream, and then around the working muscle. So that is absolutely critical, right? I mean, that is really, really necessary. So let's actually have a sort of a conversation about the air we breathe in. Now, I've put a couple of arrows here. What is this stuff we're breathing in? What's it made up of? So what is this air sort of notion? So first of all, let's say that the air breathed in, so this is what the air is like when we breathe it in. So breathed in air is made up of the following things. Firstly, it's about 20, amongst other things, for example, there's loads of nitrogen, but it's about 21% oxygen, okay? So about a fifth of the air, or the fifth, what am I trying to say? When we're breathing air into our lungs, one component within that air, that mixture of gases, is oxygen, and it accounts for about 21% of that air. So 4/5 of our air isn't oxygen, and 1/5 is, and the majority of the rest, by the way, is nitrogen, just in case you were wondering. But look at this one. We've got 0.03% of the air is CO2. So this is a really tiny proportion of air. So once we've breathed it in and we've processed it in our lungs, what's it like when we breathe it out? So breathed out air, or expired air, what is that made up of? Well, first of all, that 21% of oxygen is now lower. You might think, well, we've sucked all that in and we're going to take it all out. Maybe it's 0% oxygen. Actually, we're not that good at it. We can't get that much oxygen out of the air. So when we breathe out, the air still contains oxygen. And approximately speaking, the air we breathe out contains 16% of oxygen. So we've only been able to actually draw out a small proportion of the oxygen that we breathe in. Most of it, and if you think about it, 3/4 of it, we breathe back out again. 3/4, give or take. But what's interesting is that when we breathe out, we have a lot more CO2. So about 4% of the air we breathe out is carbon dioxide. So we're breathing out a lot more CO2 than we breathe in. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of times more than we breathe in. So that's how we affect the air. So this is the air we breathe in, and this is the air we breathe out. So why is this happening? Why is this figure going, that oxygen figure, going down? Where's it going? What's it doing? Well, oxygen, okay, the oxygen, which we would say oxygen consumed, that's actually gone into our system, gone into our bloodstream. The oxygen that is consumed is used by the working muscle, amongst other organs, by the way, used by working muscle. So that's kind of its destination, right? We get it into our systems first because we breathe it in, but the actual destination of it, at least when we think about moving, is to the working muscles. Okay, it could be to other tissues and organs of the body. It could be that it goes to the pancreas or to the liver or to the brain or whatever. But we're going to talk about here that oxygen is being transported, consumed, and transported to the working muscle. Whereas the CO2, which we're breathing out a lot more of than we're breathing in, CO2 is produced. CO2 is produced by the working muscles. Okay, now this should now seem to make sense, because we're saying that during exercise, the air we breathe in has a lot more O2 and a lot less CO2, and the air we breathe out has a lot less O2 and a lot more CO2. That makes sense according to that blue and that pink statement right there. We can actually, we actually produce CO2 when we're moving. It's what we call a byproduct. Okay, so a byproduct of movement, of producing energy for movement, is the production of CO2, and we even call it like a waste product, and it's produced by energy for movement. So, because we need this oxygen thing to power our exercise, we sometimes say that we experience something called an oxygen debt. Okay, an oxygen debt. Now, what do we mean by that? What would be an oxygen debt? And when we talk about an oxygen debt, we're talking about the extra amount of oxygen that we require. The extra amount of oxygen we require when exercising. Now, why is it a debt? Okay, because I'm saying, we can get that air into the lungs, we can extract the oxygen from it. Why would it be a debt? Why do we need to sort of run up a debt of some kind? Well, the idea here is that when we start exercising, we start requiring oxygen, and we start making energy before we can get the additional oxygen into our bodies. And as a result of that, we start working anaerobically. Okay, so we start working anaerobically, not in the presence of additional oxygen, because we can't get it there fast enough. It takes us 2 or 3 minutes to kind of speed up, which is one of the reasons we do a warm-up, for example, so we can minimise that time. But because we're having to do anaerobic work until we get the additional oxygen into our muscles, we have to build up this thing called an oxygen debt. And if you think about it, it's the very reason why when we stop exercising, you think about the last time you exercised, when you stopped, did you go from to straight away breathing normally? No, it took a period of time, right? You gradually reduced your breathing rate, gradually reduced your breathing depth, because you are paying off this oxygen debt, okay? It's paying off this oxygen debt. So it's really important we understand that. Okay, a couple of lifestyle things to finish off with. I have spoken to you in previous videos about smoking. In fact, I've even said with smoking, don't do it. So I really hope you're not. It's not very good for you. Smoking, and cigarettes particularly, they produce something rather nasty. They produce a nasty, nasty substance. Amongst others, there are loads of chemicals in them, but they produce something called carbon monoxide, which we breathe in, okay, if we smoke. And what this carbon monoxide does is it reduces our ability to transport oxygen. Okay, so if you think about this now, you might think, why do smokers seem to be less fit? One of the reasons is we have a reduced ability to transport O2 in the blood, because we've got this carbon monoxide in our blood which stops oxygen attaching to hemoglobin. So that's a bad thing. So we really need to think about this concept of smoking. Okay, if you are a smoker, you seriously need to think, and if you're a smoker and you're an athlete, that really shouldn't be the case. We need to think about whether that's the way we want to be, and that's the way we want to sort of live our lives, especially if we're going towards an athletic performance type lifestyle. Okay, enough from me. I hope I haven't confused you too much with that lesson. Thanks very much, as ever, for listening and watching.